People often think anxiety is the problem. No, it is not. The real problem is what anxiety does to the way you think. It changes how you judge situations, how you read other people's actions, and how you make decisions. It quietly places a filter over your mind until ordinary events begin to look like threats, small mistakes feel like disasters, and uncertainty starts to feel unbearable. That's why two people can face the exact same situation and walk away with completely different experiences. One sees a challenge, the other sees a warning. The difference isn't always the situation itself, it's the lens through which the mind is looking. What's especially difficult is that anxiety rarely announces itself by saying, "I'm making your thinking less clear." Instead, it disguises itself as caution. It tells you that you're simply being careful. It convinces you that if you keep thinking a little longer, checking one more time, or preparing for every possible outcome, you'll finally feel safe. But that feeling almost never arrives. The more you feed anxiety with endless thinking, the hungrier it becomes. Many people believe that thinking more leads to better decisions. In calm moments, that can be true. But anxious thinking works differently. It doesn't solve problems. It circles around them. It's like driving around the same roundabout for hours, believing you're making progress simply because the car is moving. You're busy, but you're not getting anywhere. Long before modern psychology gave this pattern a name, the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius noticed something that still applies today. He reminded himself that people are often disturbed not by events themselves, but by the judgments they make about those events. He wasn't saying that life is easy or that difficult things don't happen. He was pointing to something much more practical. Between what happens and how you respond, your mind creates a story. When anxiety takes control, that story becomes darker, louder, and more convincing than reality. You can see this almost anywhere. A manager sends a short email asking to meet tomorrow. One employee reads it and thinks, "We'll probably discuss the next project." Another spends the entire evening convinced they're about to lose their job. By the next morning, they've imagined financial problems, disappointment from family members, and months of unemployment. The meeting lasts 10 minutes, and the manager simply offers them a new responsibility. Nothing in reality matched the story anxiety created, yet the emotional pain they experienced the night before was completely real. This is one of anxiety's favorite tricks. It treats possibility as certainty. It takes a small chance of something going wrong and presents it as though it has already happened. Once that pattern begins, your brain starts gathering evidence to support the fear. Every neutral event becomes suspicious. Every unanswered message feels personal. Every delay seems meaningful. Before long, you're no longer observing life. You're collecting proof for a story your anxious mind has already written. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a thinking bias, but you don't need technical words to understand it. Think about a dirty window. If the glass is covered in dust, the world outside looks dull, even though nothing outside has changed. Cleaning the window doesn't change the world. It changes what you're able to see. Anxiety works the same way. It doesn't always change reality. It changes your view of reality. That explains why trying to argue with every anxious thought often becomes exhausting. You knock one fear down, and another quickly takes its place. The real issue isn't a single thought. It's the habit of treating every fearful thought as if it deserves a full investigation. Here's a simple situation many people have experienced. A friend doesn't reply to a message for several hours. Someone whose mind is calm usually assumes that person is busy. Someone whose mind is filled with anxiety begins creating explanations. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe they're upset with me. Maybe they're pulling away. Hours later, the friend replies, apologizing because their phone battery died during work. The friendship was never in danger, but anxiety turns silence into evidence. This is why clear thinking isn't about forcing yourself to be positive. It's about learning to separate facts from stories. Facts are usually surprisingly simple. The message hasn't been answered yet. The meeting is tomorrow. The results aren't back. Everything beyond that is often imagination, filling empty space. Daniel Kahneman, whose work changed the way we understand decision-making, showed that the human mind doesn't always process information objectively. Under pressure, we rely on quick mental shortcuts. They help us survive immediate danger, but they also make us more likely to expect threats where none exist. Anxiety pushes those shortcuts into overdrive. Instead of asking, "What is most likely?" the anxious mind keeps asking, "What is the worst thing that could happen?" Those are two completely different questions, and they usually lead to completely different decisions. The interesting part is that anxiety often mistakes urgency for importance. It makes every thought feel like it needs an immediate answer, but not every thought deserves your attention. Some thoughts are simply passing weather. If you chase every cloud, you'll spend your whole day running without ever reaching clear skies. One useful way to think about this is to imagine your attention as money. Every fearful thought asks you to spend some of it. Most people never notice how expensive anxiety becomes because they keep paying small amounts all day long. A few minutes worrying here, another 10 minutes replaying a conversation there, an hour imagining tomorrow's problems before going to bed. By the end of the day, they've spent nearly all their mental energy on situations that never happened. Anxiety is, in many ways, a thief that convinces you to hand over your own peace voluntarily. The good news is that your mind can learn a different habit. Clear thinkers aren't people who never experience fear. They simply become more selective about which thoughts deserve their attention. Instead of treating every anxious prediction like a trusted advisor, they begin treating it like an opinion that still needs evidence. That small shift changes everything. It creates just enough distance between you and your thoughts for wisdom to enter the conversation. The moment you stop believing that every thought deserves your trust, your relationship with anxiety begins to change. That doesn't mean fearful thoughts disappear overnight. They probably won't. What changes is that they no longer sit in the driver's seat. They become passengers. They're still in the car, but they don't get to decide where you're going. Think about how often people confuse a feeling with a fact. Feeling nervous before giving a presentation doesn't mean you'll do badly. Feeling uncertain before making an important decision doesn't mean it's the wrong decision. Feeling afraid doesn't automatically mean you're in danger. Anxiety blurs those lines so well that emotions start to feel like evidence. Once that happens, judgment becomes cloudy because you're no longer asking, "What is true?" You're asking, "What feels true?" Those are rarely the same thing. Carl Jung believed that much of what shapes our lives operates beneath the surface of our awareness. In simple terms, he understood that if we don't recognize the patterns running inside us, those patterns quietly begin making decisions for us. Anxiety is one of those patterns. It doesn't just create worry, it creates habits of thinking. After enough repetition, the mind starts expecting problems before it has any reason to. It becomes so familiar with scanning for danger that it forgets how to notice safety. You can see this in everyday life. Two neighbors hear a loud noise outside at night. One looks through the window, realizes a trash bin has fallen over because of the wind, and goes back to bed. The other immediately imagines someone trying to break into the house. Their heart races, sleep disappears, and they spend the next hour checking every lock. The noise was identical. The difference was the story built around it. That doesn't mean anxiety is foolish. In fact, anxiety exists for a good reason. Thousands of years ago, being alert to danger helped people survive. If early humans ignored every strange sound in the bushes, some of them didn't live long enough to pass on their genes. The problem is that your brain hasn't fully adjusted to modern life. It often reacts to a difficult conversation, an exam, a delayed text message, or a financial decision with the same alarm system that once responded to wild animals. Your body prepares for survival, even when the real challenge requires careful thinking instead of quick escape. This is why rushing important decisions while anxious is usually a mistake. Anxiety demands speed. Wisdom prefers patience. There's an old habit many experienced negotiators follow before making a major decision. If emotions are running high, they wait. Not because they're avoiding the decision, but because they know that strong emotions shrink perspective. What looks obvious today may look completely different after one good night's sleep. Time doesn't solve every problem, but it often clears the mental fog that anxiety creates. A simple family situation shows this well. A parent sees their teenager come home unusually quiet. Anxiety immediately starts offering explanations. Something terrible must have happened. They're hiding something. The parent becomes tense, asks sharp questions, and the conversation quickly turns into an argument. Later, they discover the teenager was simply exhausted after a difficult day at school. The anxious story created a conflict that never needed to exist. This is one reason emotionally steady people seem calmer than everyone else. They don't rush to fill in missing information. They allow space for facts to appear. That patience protects them from making unnecessary mistakes. One of the biggest traps anxiety sets is the search for complete certainty. The mind starts believing, if I can just know exactly what's going to happen, then I'll finally relax. But life doesn't work that way. There is no career with perfect certainty, no relationship with perfect certainty, no investment, business, or major life decision comes with absolute guarantees. Ironically, people who insist on total certainty often end up feeling more anxious because they're chasing something that doesn't exist. Meanwhile, those who accept a reasonable amount of uncertainty usually think more clearly because they stop fighting reality. The Stoic philosophers understood this long before modern psychology. They focused their energy on what they could influence instead of exhausting themselves over what they couldn't control. That wasn't blind optimism. It was practical thinking. Every minute spent trying to control the uncontrollable is a minute taken away from actions that could genuinely improve your situation. Another helpful habit is learning to slow down the conversation inside your own mind. Anxiety speaks very quickly. It jumps from one conclusion to another without stopping to check the evidence. Clear thinking asks quieter questions. What facts do I actually know? What assumptions am I making? Is there another explanation that fits the evidence just as well? Those questions may seem simple, but they interrupt the momentum of anxious thinking. Instead of letting fear write the entire story, they invite reason back into the room. There's also something important to understand about mistakes. Anxiety often promises that worrying will prevent them. In reality, excessive worry usually creates new mistakes. People send messages they later regret because they panic. They avoid opportunities because they assume failure before trying. They spend so much time preparing for every possible outcome that they miss the chance to act. The cost of anxiety isn't only emotional discomfort. Sometimes it's the life you never lived because fear convinced you to wait for perfect confidence. Confidence has never meant having all the answers. Real confidence is trusting yourself to handle whatever answer life gives you. That's a much stronger foundation because it doesn't depend on everything going according to plan. If there's one idea worth remembering from everything you've heard, it's this. Clear thinking doesn't begin when life becomes predictable. It begins when you stop asking anxiety to predict the future for you. Anxiety is designed to detect possible danger, not to tell you what will actually happen. Those are completely different jobs, and confusing them is what clouds judgment. From now on, when your mind starts racing toward the worst possible outcome, don't ask whether the thought feels convincing. Ask whether it has earned your trust. That single question creates a pause, and inside that pause is where better decisions are made. The goal isn't to become someone who never feels anxious. That's not realistic, and it isn't necessary. The goal is to become someone who can recognize anxiety without handing it control. Once you learn that skill, your thoughts become clearer, your choices become wiser, and your life is no longer directed by every fear that happens to pass through your mind. Anxiety may still knock on the door from time to time, but it no longer gets to decide how the story ends.